Ladies and gentlemen, Violent Games here. Today I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on Senua's Sacrifice. I'm going to be doing this on a pros and cons basis, meaning I'm just going to go down a list basically and tell you what I like about the game and what I dislike about the game. Without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that we have to give as a positive to Senua's Sacrifice is just the great graphics. The visuals are very, very impressive at a nice 1080p resolution. The graphics, are just very realistic looking. Senua herself looks exactly like the actor, to the point where it's almost creepy, so I definitely love that about this game. So another thing that I like about Senua's Sacrifice that is actually very unique to any other game that I've played is this very unique narrative tool that they use for the voices in Senua's head. Basically, Senua has voices in her head that are constantly telling her to do one thing or another, or are just having casual conversation amongst themselves. It's very, very interesting, but if you're wearing 3D headphones, these voices in your head will actually kind of move from side to side. Sometimes you'll feel like the voice is above you or below you or to the back right of you, and I just love that narrative tool. It really helps you feel like you have a psychosis yourself when you're playing the game. When these voices are just constantly going at it, it's really, really awesome. Another thing worth mentioning on the pro side of things is that the gameplay of Senua's Sacrifice throughout its campaign duration has some really memorable moments. However, I find the base gameplay mechanics to be rather mediocre, which we'll cover in the cons section. I find that there are certain moments that really define the game, and that once you go through them, you're like, wow, that was really interesting and memorable. There's really two that kind of stick out in my mind. One's kind of a well scene where it's really, really tense. I don't want to spoil anything, obviously. And then there's another where you're trying to solve one of the more mundane puzzles in the game. However, there's something in a room trying to kill you at the same time, and it creates this really tense moment of trying to avoid this monster while you're trying to solve this very mundane puzzle, and it actually adds something interesting to what was a very boring mechanic, in all honesty. And as for my final praise, I have to say, guys, the story and the ending is very, very satisfying. If you're paying attention well enough to everything that's going on around you, and you're, taking time and actually pacing yourself through the game, the story and the end is just very, very satisfying. I will say that if you're not the type of person that likes an emotional, kind of bittersweet end, you're not going to appreciate it as much, so be aware from that. But if you're kind of a bit more of my sensibilities, this game might jerk a few tears out of you once it reaches its conclusion. I don't know why I'm about to die. I'm about to cry right now. I'm just kidding. But yeah, the ending of this game is really, really good, and let's be honest, a lot of games in the modern day have this problem where the ending just isn't satisfying. That is not the case with Senua's Sacrifice. You get a clear ending that explains what is going on, and the character goes through a development that is very, very satisfying. So if you like narrative games especially, this is going to be one you're going to want to pick up. So now let's move on into the cons segment, or the negative segment, whatever you want to refer to it as. First off, this is kind of a big problem, and this is gonna like polarize people right when I bring up this criticism, but you have to hear me out. The first problem I have with Senua's Sacrifice is the combat is mediocre and unsatisfying. It works, it functions, it does what it needs to do, but it's not compelling in any way, shape, or form. Furthermore, the game doesn't really go out of its way to teach you how the combat works, so you kind of have to learn by just pressing different buttons and seeing what happens. So it just, I just really didn't like the combat in this game. Even when I did get an understanding of it, I even found some cheap ways to actually bypass combat as well, which I won't get into here. But, I don't know, maybe someone will ask for it in the comments and I'll let you know, but the combat just isn't satisfying in Senua's Sacrifice. It functions, it works, it's responsive. I never thought it was cheap in any way. In fact, the ASMR binaural narrative thing that I mentioned earlier in the pro section actually takes place in combat as well, which is really the only interesting mechanic within combat. So, for example, if an enemy's about to attack you from behind, a voice in your head will say, behind you, and you can actually kind of time parries around that dialogue. So it's very, very interesting that you can pull off back parries because of the voices in your head looking out for you. But other than that, the combat is just basic. The enemy variety isn't substantially different. Like, the enemies look almost the exact same, to the point that one of the bosses in the game even just looks like a modified version of the basic enemy. It's very, very bland. Another problem I have with Senua's Sacrifice is just the filler puzzle gameplay. The majority of the puzzles throughout Senua's Sacrifice are just way too basic, and they vary very slightly. I know I used vary in two contexts there, but let me explain. So, one style of puzzle solving is you go up to a door and you're presented with runes. You stare at the door. It's mandatory that you stare at this door, by the way, otherwise you will not collect the runes. And then you have to go and run around throughout your environment and find those runes organically within the environment. Sometimes posts or like a certain hole in a wall will look like a rune. And from there, you'll collect the rune, go back to the door, and once you acquire all the runes, the door will open. The other version of puzzle solving, god damn it, is that you'll try to align a mirage by creating a certain angle on your camera to kind of line up this mirage so that it will create the path for you. So you'll like align fragments of a bridge and oh, the bridge is complete. So it's basically kind of in theory the same thing, and it's never interesting except for in one instance that I mentioned earlier with the rune puzzle in the room with the threat. So yeah, there's a lot of filler puzzle gameplay. It's mostly padding, and yes, there is some narrative delivered while you're doing some of these puzzles, but god, is it boring. It's just not, you're never going to play this game and be like, the reason I had fun was because I did these mundane, bland-ass puzzles. It's just kind of crap. Another criticism I have about this game is one that I think is going to be obvious to anyone who's played it before, and that is the game is extremely linear. Now, granted, it's a $30 title. We weren't expecting this big open world from Senua's Sacrifice, though it does feel kind of restrictive, and it almost feels like you're on rails at times with how linear this game is. Though I don't think it ultimately deters from the experience that you have, I just think it's a criticism that's worth bringing up. The final criticism that I could have about Senua's Sacrifice is that the game length is honestly very short. However, I feel like this is easily could be made up by the fact that the game only carries a $30 price tag. So I'm going to leave that up to you as to whether or not you think that that is a significant enough issue to complain about or not. I think the game length is fine for the asking price, given that some games that are AAA games release for $60 and don't have 6 hours worth of content. So that's where I'm standing on this one. So taking everything into consideration, can I recommend Senua's Sacrifice as a purchase for you, the viewer? The answer is yes and no. Honestly, I feel like it depends on what kind of gamer you are that is going to really determine whether or not you enjoy this game. So let me just explain really quickly. If you're buying a game for mechanics alone, and gameplay alone and puzzle solving alone, you're not going to have a good time playing Senua's Sacrifice, because everything seen here has been seen and done before. It's very average. It's not like bad or anything, but it's not good. So I honestly think that if you're playing this game for its mechanics and combat alone, you're not going to have a good time. However, if you're interested in a really strong narrative with very, very deep and emotional themes surrounding love and loss and dealing with a psychosis, then you're going to have a great time playing Senua's Sacrifice. That's really where all the joy comes in. Now, granted, the gameplay does have a few, standout moments like I mentioned earlier. I just think that if you're enjoying a game for raw mechanics alone, you're not going to have fun throughout the length of the game. So that's what I feel about Senua's Sacrifice. I think if you're looking for a strong narrative experience with a emotional, kind of bittersweet ending, this is the game for you. But if you're buying this game for, I want to fight these monsters in an interesting way, then no, this is not the game for you. There's never really any super stellar moments throughout the gameplay, in my honest opinion. Anyways, guys, this is Violent Games signing off. I hope that you learned some more about Senua's Sacrifice, and I hope you consider giving the game a shot. I really do, on my personal opinion. I think this game's really, really good, but is it a 9 out of 10 like some of these reviewers are saying? Fuck no. In order for a game to be a 9 out of 10, you need both. You need both mechanics and you need narrative. You can't just have one or the other and tell me your product's worth a 9 out of 10. I disagree with that notion, but yeah. In my honest opinion, guys, it's a good game, and it's worth the $30 price tag, so...
Yeah, I had fun. Bye.